Good morning. Welcome to our fifth segment of the series on racial equity and inclusion. Today, we are pleased to present Courageous Conversations with Jermaine Moore of the Mars Hill Group. My name is Sophie Tiem, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Leadership Program Specialist for Enterprise Bank. I'd like to thank our series partners, the Greater Lowell Community Foundation, the Lowell Development and Financial Corporation, the Greater Lowell Chamber of Commerce, the Lowell Plan, Harbor Care, Lawrence Partnership, the Essex County Community Foundation, the Nonprofit Alliance, and the Theodore Edson Parker Foundation for continuing to support these presentations. For informational and flashback purposes, part one had been about exploring DEI and reminding us how we can be more aware of the systemic racism which has hindered many communities of color for hundreds of years. Part two covered how to cultivate an inclusive mindset. Part three comprised of a panel who gave us real-life examples of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Part four was titled, Make Room for Us, Changing the Racial Composition and Culture of Your Board. After a handful of discussions, our planning team thought that it was appropriate at this time to address a skill set for what many may be uncomfortable with, talking about DEI with peers, team members, and if applicable, friends and family. Once the topic was agreed upon, we then brainstormed who would be a good presenter on this challenging subject. My good friend and colleague, Kara Morehouse, and I had attended a learning series organized by the New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility. I immediately recalled how Jermaine stood out amongst all the presenters of the multiple series. When Kara mentioned she had brought him up as a possible speaker in the past, it was like fate. We were destined to have Jermaine join us for this very session. Jermaine is the founder of the Mars Hill Group, where he specializes in diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership development, executive coaching, team development, culture assessment and development, communication training, and change management. An active instructor for the University of New Hampshire's Professional Development and Training Program, Jermaine serves as the Diversity Director for SHRM's New Hampshire State Council and is a board member for the Diversity Workforce Coalition, whose mission is to promote diversity in the workplace through education, training, and enhanced networking opportunities. Thank you all for making the time to join us during this very important discussion on how to facilitate difficult DEI conversations and how to foster healthy and productive relationships through dialogue. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jermaine Moore.
Well, Sophie, thank you so much. Such kind words, such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all this morning. I am so excited to spend the next hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half with you, really digging into what I think is a very important topic. Man, I feel so humbled to follow such great presenters in this program. Looking at the names, the subjects that you've dug into over the previous months, it's just wonderful. Today, like Sophie mentioned, we're going to talk about skill development. I get the sense that the previous sessions was about raising awareness within ourselves and within our organizations. Today, we're going to take some of that awareness and figure out how do we apply this practically? How do we have conversations, oftentimes very difficult conversations regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Again, we're going to focus on courageous conversations. I'm not going to spend any time here. Sophie did a wonderful job, if not humbling, for me to share a little bit about my background. But what I will tell you that no matter what I focus on, no matter what workshop or training that I do, it tends to be very, very interactive. So today is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a lot of me talking. I really believe in the collective wisdom of a group, that there's a lot that we can gain from one another and sharing perspectives, which means I'm going to encourage you to ask questions along the way. I'm going to prioritize your questions, your needs over any slides or content that I have prepared. My goal is to meet you where you are. And my training intent is always your development. If you leave here knowing a little bit more, allowing you to be a little bit better, I think that would be a wonderful thing. It'd be a great use of your time. I really do find a lot of joy in helping people learn and sharing strategies that will help you achieve not only your personal goals, but maybe your organizational goals as well. Speaking of some of the programs that I offer, as we jump right into it, One of the things that I do with organizations now is I offer what is called these lunch and learns. And lunch and learns are these micro learning sessions. And during these lunch and learns, we may talk about things like examining privilege or gender identity or inclusive language. The goal is to create some space where we can all engage with one another, and it keeps the conversation going. So we have these workshops, but lunch and learns are pretty informal. It's a time for us to share and to dig in to a very important topic. One of the cool things about these lunch and learns, and sometimes they're called lunch and learns. I have another client that calls them Focus Fridays. My favorite, they call Real Talk with Jermaine. I love that a lot. That's my favorite one because we're having real talk. But what's cool about these lunch and learn sessions or these hour-long informal sessions is that it's pretty flexible. We can respond to what's going on during the day, whatever's going on, in that time. And as you remember, earlier this year, there has continued to be this rise in sentiment of Asian hate, culminating in the attack in the spa in Atlanta where 6 people died. Tragic incident, but it really highlighted that there's some work that needed to be done here. So one of my clients said, hey, I want to have our lunch and learns. I want to focus on this rising sentiment of Asian hate. I want to meet our people where they are. We have some Asian American brothers and sisters that work here in this place. We want to make sure they feel supported. So the HR director sent out an email, just open invitation. Hey, we're going to have this lunch and learn. This is what we're going to focus on. We'd love for you to join. And you can accept or decline an invitation. It was not an obligation. In one of her responses from one of her employees, this is what she received back. Thanks, but I don't hate Asians, except for the Chinese, given what they did about coronavirus. Can you imagine? So of course, this HR director called me and she was like, Jermaine, what do I do with this? I said, it sounds like you need to have a courageous conversation. It sounds like you need to approach this very sensitive topic and really get real with this employee. So my question is for you. I want you to think if you were in this position. And this is a poll that I have for you. And Andrew, if you can please launch the poll. But my question for you is, how comfortable are you addressing sensitive issues or initiating a tough conversation? So maybe it's confronting racist, sexist, or homophobic behavior. Maybe engaging with someone with a radically different perspective than yours. So please, love to get your comfort level. So either you are very comfortable, you eat these conversations for breakfast, you live for these types of conversations, you're comfortable, you've learned how to have these conversations well, so you're comfortable doing them. Uncomfortable, I'll do it if I feel really compelled, but it's tough for me. And finally, there's very uncomfortable. I will do it. I will do all of my power to avoid these types of conversations. Where do you land on this continuum or spectrum of comfortability in having these types of conversations? Andrew, can we share those poll results? Very good. So it looks like we have the majority of you feel a bit uncomfortable. You'll do it if you feel compelled. If you really feel compelled to do it, you'll have these conversations, but I'm assuming it's not something that you enjoy or something that you like to do. 36%, so a little bit more than a third said I'm comfortable. I've learned how to have these conversations well. Good for you. One of you, 55, said I'm very comfortable. I eat these conversations for breakfast. I would love to meet you and have a conversation with you because that sounds awesome. And then 4 of you said very uncomfortable. I'll do all in my power to avoid. If this conversation is coming, I run the other direction. It's really so very uncomfortable for me. Thank you all for participating in that poll. I want to acknowledge that, we all have different levels of comfort when it comes to having these conversations. There are not easy conversations to have, but that's why they are considered courageous conversations. Simply put, a courageous conversation is one we have in the face of this fear, in the face of this discomfort, right? There's no courage without fear. We feel that fear and we do it anyway. These are hard conversations to have. Sometimes we know going in that they may be highly charged, a lot of emotion, oftentimes very strong difference of opinions, ones in which we're concerned about how people are going to react, in having these conversations. Over the last 18 months or so, we've seen a lot of companies make statements. At their events of 2020, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Casey Goodson, the list goes on and on. And some companies made statements. Some companies did not make statements, although they wrestled whether or not they should make a statement. Do you know what I found most common? The most common underlying reason why some companies chose not to speak up, and it probably doesn't surprise you that that most common reason was fear. Either fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of alienating a certain segment of their client or customer base, or even fear of accountability. Even if they said the right thing, right? Now they have to. Now what are they going to do about it? There was this murky waters for them, and some they just didn't know what was ahead of them, and some just decided that they couldn't jump in. They just didn't have the stomach for it, right? So we all feel this fear. The question is, are we going to do it anyway? That is where our courage comes in, and we can have this courage as individuals, especially, but organizations can also display this level of organizational courage where we do the hard things, we do the fearful things. First, we got to understand when to have these conversations. Well, we can have these conversations when it comes time to take a stand. When we know it's the right thing to do, and we have to take a stand. We can have this courageous conversations. Maybe we're addressing certain behavior, prejudiced behavior, words or actions, addressing disruptive or disrespectful behavior in our workplace, resolving strong differences of opinion. I would tell you that we've lost this ability, not only in our workplaces, but in our communities and in our country, to just engage with each other in a civil way. The ability to civilly engage and discourse with one another is this lost art. No one's talking to one another anymore. We're debating, we're yelling from the rooftops, we're all in our own bubbles, and we're just not listening to one another. In our workspaces, we can model what this can look like for everyone else, and even our community and even in our country. So we can have influence and impact here. Dealing with sensitive issues, something needs to change or has gone wrong. These are ways that reasons why we may need to have a courageous conversation. Quick note on allyship. I think you all probably are familiar with this term and know what it is. It's a person who works to facilitate the development of and improve the experience of all employees, in particular those who are underrepresented or in groups that are marginalized. When we think about allyship, I want you to think more of it as a verb. How do I do allyship than a noun? How do I be an ally? Because I think allyship is about what you are doing. And some of the things that you can do are here in this slide. Karen Catlin wrote this great book called Better Allies. And she said there are 7 archetypes to being an ally, 7 that she's identified. There could be more. There's the sponsor, the champion, the amplifier, the advocate, the scholar. And the scholar is someone who over the past 18 months, for instance, have been educating themselves on some of these issues. They realize, oh, there's an issue here. I don't know enough. I need to learn more. So they're reading books, they're reading articles, they're trying to really, build their own awareness when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and some of the issues that are facing some folks in this, in whether it's our organizations or in our community. There's the confidant. That's the friend. You're the person that that person can go to when they are struggling. That shoulder to lean on when needed. But there's also one other archetype that I really believe we all can be. We all get to decide what type of allies we want to be. And a lot of times that fits our strengths and who we are. But there's one I'm going to encourage us all to be, and that is an upstander. An upstander is someone who always speaks up when they witness behavior, speech that is degrading or offensive. They take action. If we see anyone in our company being bullied or harassed, they are the ones standing in the gap. They call out inappropriate behavior. If you happen to be in this privileged position, you have this ability to call out unacceptable behavior towards underrepresented people, so they can be heard. Sometimes those who are underrepresented or historically marginalized, they may not be comfortable raising issues due to fear of backlash or being labeled or jeopardizing some of their professional relationships. So there's a role that we can play here. So I'm going to encourage you all to be to have your allyship be to be an upstander, to be able to express that allyship and your ability to speak up and use your voice. But that takes courage. The question I have for you next is, why is it important to have these conversations? Why is it important to have these conversations? If we were in a regular training session, I would do breakout sessions and we would talk in small groups and come back and debrief with one another. But I want you to ponder why it's important to even have these conversations. I think that why question is so very important, because why is what motivates, right? It's more than the what, it's more than the how. We're going to talk about how in a little bit, but we always start with why. Simon Sinek wrote this book starting with why, because he recognized that that is where our motivations come from. And so in order to have courage, we have to understand why it's even important to have these conversations, because that's where we draw this motivation from. We have to be very settled on why it's important to have these conversations and even our personal why. So I want to challenge you to think about your values. Typically, when I work with organizations, I start with culture. And I say culture and our values are the cultural cornerstones of our organization. We have to start with culture. Someone asked the question out, and I'll answer it right now. And thank you for those who sent in questions beforehand. She said, after initial DEI conversations, how do you continue to foster change in your organization to avoid a one and done approach? Well, this is how you do it. You infuse DEI into your culture. You make it a part of your how. You make sure it's not framed as this one-off initiative or there's something that's happening over here, but this is just who we are. And doing this work allows us to be the best version of ourselves. It's not something different. It is how we live out our values every single day, getting DE&I right. And if we start talking about it as if it is a part of our culture, it's infused with just who we are, then it feels way more natural. And it's sustainable over time because our culture tends to endure. Every organization has a culture. The question is, are we intentional about that culture? Culture endures. It endures over time and endures through crises as well. Over the last 18 months, we've kind of got a chance to see what our cultures are really like. But culture endures. And so if we want this work to be shared, pervasive, implicit, we have to connect it and infuse it to our culture. Same thing with having these conversations, and it starts with our own values. So we all know what values are. There's these beliefs and principles that guide us in our personal, professional lives. They are kind of our center, our North Star. And oftentimes when having these conversations or at least thinking about having these conversations, we neglect how important it is to have these conversations for our own personal well-being, and how it allows us to live out our own values. So I encourage you to write down your values, whatever your top 3, top 5 values are. And as you think about having these conversations, just like we ask organizations to connect DEI work to their values and their culture, I want you to connect these conversations to your own values and your own culture. If you value respect, then where does this conversation fit in making sure we respect everyone? If you value empathy, relationships, love, connection, all family, all these things that we tend to hold very, very dear, my question to you or my challenge to you is make sure the why of having these conversations is connected to those values. Make that connection on your own. Because there's this word, and I think we're all familiar with, and that word is hypocrisy, or being a hypocrite. Hypocrite came from this Greek word hypocrites, which means an actor or stage player. So if you went to the theater back then, the actors were called the hypocrites. And if you grew up in the theater, you know that the symbols for theaters are the masks, right? The happy mask or the sad mask. And what these actors used to do is hold up these masks to their face to convey an emotion. Well, of course, the word hypocrites and hypocrite start to take this figurative meaning. And it means any person wearing this figurative mask or pretending to be someone or something they are not. That's what a hypocrite is, right? Their outside doesn't match the inside. They're smiling, but they're sad. That's hypocritical, right? So as we think about a time when we felt strongly about something and didn't speak of it, and a time we felt strongly about something, but we did speak about it, or just used our voice, I want you to think about the difference between the two. A time you felt strongly about something that you didn't speak up, and a time you felt strongly about something and you did speak up.
Jermaine?
Yes, please.
There's a question for you.
Let's do it.
Okay. What if you work with a such a small group that no one is willing to speak up
Yeah.
to the bully.
There is safety in numbers. I get that for 100%. I get it. These conversations are much easier to have if we're speaking with one voice, right? If there's a group of us. But I think this is where it takes courage. I think if not you, who really? If not you, who? Sometimes we have to realize the awesome responsibility that we have to use our voice, and that voice comes with a little bit of risk. But I think that's why this values conversation is so very important, because I will tell you this, I've never lost sleep when I spoke up about something when it was in line with my values. I've never lost sleep. I slept well if I used my voice because it was in line with what I believed and I thought it was fair and I thought it was right. I have, however, lost sleep. Till to this day, I can think of those times when I was in this situation and I did not use my voice. And I question myself, why didn't I speak up? Like, why didn't I say anything? The opportunity was right there for me to say something and I missed it. I lost sleep because in that moment, I wasn't living according to my values. In that moment, I was a hypocrite. I was being inconsistent with the things that I believe. So I'm going to encourage you for your own well-being to live authentically, live according to your values, speak up because it's the right thing to do. Let that drive you. Now, it doesn't mean this conversation is going to always go well and always go right, because sometimes they don't. I've spoken up and it didn't quite go the way I hoped it went. I still slept easy. I still slept well because I thought speaking up was the right thing to do. And so I would still encourage you to speak up. Unless, by the way, there is physical harm. Don't put yourself in a position where you don't feel physically safe. Then I think you have to be wise and not put yourself in a position where you feel like this person can attack you for speaking up. Then I would, I'm not suggesting that you put yourself physically in danger, but it is, kind of emotionally risky. And I want to encourage you to consider taking that step. But great question.
The person added, especially if the same person is bullied over and over.
Mm.
I don't know if that changes your answer at all.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think but again, this kind of goes back to sometimes, if not you, who else? If we kind of see this behavior happening over and over and over again, something needs to change. And you can be that catalyst for change, for absolutely sure. Very good. And that person being bullied, we'll thank you for it.
She clarified. She says, what I meant is that no one ever challenges the person.
Yeah, I get it. Because it's hard. It's just hard to push back, for sure. Yeah.
Thanks. My
pleasure. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you for the question. Keep them coming. When I do D&I work, I work with organizations. I often say this work is about closing the gap between espoused values and lived behavior. Just like we have values, organizations have values. They say we're collaborative and we're innovative and we're about team and we respect one another. And DEI work can help us live those values out. But they also can do the same thing for us. These things that we value, these things that we hold dear, we can live out these values by having these types of conversations. Because ultimately we want to be authentic, right? We want to have authentic interactions. We want to have integrity. Our outside matches the inside. What you see is who I am. We have to include our personal well-being when it comes to these conversations. And so my encouragement to you as we get into how to have these conversations is to think about how you would like to walk through this life, right? Do we want to walk through this life with integrity, living out our values or not? And I'm going to compel you to live them out. We should all strive to have authentic interactions with the people we come in contact with every day, especially those people we work with day to day. Fair or not, we spend a lot of time at work. So we see some of our coworkers more than our family. And we want to have authentic interactions with them and be able to speak our mind when we see it. If you don't talk it out, you're going to act it out. So this is an old saying, and I believe it. There's this saying at the sign at the bottom of a hiking trail that leads to a mountain. And the sign at this foot of this hiking trail says, it isn't the mountains ahead of you that's going to wear you out. It's the pebble in your shoe that's going to wear you out. And oftentimes when we have these things that we care about deeply, but we're not expressing, we're not talking through, it becomes this pebble in our shoe. And it leads to unresolved conflicts, suspicion, distrust, passive aggressiveness. All of a sudden starts to affect the relationships that we have with people. It affects how we interact with them, how we communicate with them. Worse yet, it can affect in this outburst of anger. Sometimes we just can't take it anymore. We just blow up at people. And then all of a sudden, we're way down this path of unproductivity. And by the way, most people are fear having these conversations because they fear damaging relationships. And you're not doing your relationships any favor by not having these conversations. As a matter of fact, having these conversations is a sign that you care about the relationships. We ignore the things that we don't care about. There's an ancient proverb that says, better is open rebuke than love that is concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, right? So the question that I have for you is not, what will happen if you have this conversation, but the question I want you to ponder is, what will happen if you don't have this conversation? How's that going to affect your relationship, right? How's that going to affect your ability to live authentically? So let's get into how to have this conversation, but I'm going to pause before we get into the how to answer any questions that you have. Any additional questions, Andrew?
Yes, there is. What are your thoughts about going back and initiating a conversation after the fact, maybe when you've had some time to think about what to say?
Yes. I think that's a fantastic thing. We have to understand if we're in a place to be able to have this conversation. Sometimes we need to receive information. We're just not ready to share information. If we need more time, then we should ask for that time and feel free to go back. One of the things that you'll hear me say a little bit later on is that when trying to create this brave space to have these conversations, we have to accept non-closure. You probably heard that term, which means that we aren't going to always be able to wrap these conversations up in a neat little bow, right? Some things we have to sit with, some questions we have to kind of reflect on, some things just have to marinate with us. And so it'd be great is if, all right, half hour, we did it, we're done, we can move on. Sometimes it takes a series of conversations to get to some common ground and some understanding. And not only will I say that's okay, but it's to be absolutely expected at times. Great question.
I have one more for you.
Please.
What if the person says that they are open for the conversation, but it always finishes in a fight or argument?
Yes. Great question. Because we tend to start strong, but then somehow it deteriorates, right? And now we're arguing with one another. Very good. I'm gonna answer that question here soon in a couple slides. Very good.
All set on my end.
All right, good stuff. All right. We want to have this conversation. We feel that there's something we need to talk about. It's a sensitive issue. Maybe it's a behavior that we want to address. Someone said something that we want to address. It's very important that we think about what to do before the conversation, before even getting into the conversation. The work that we put in before the conversation is key. Even when doing diversity, African inclusion work and training, I spend a lot of time setting up our workshop, asking people how I would like them to show up. Getting clear expectations for what's going to happen over the next however much time we are together. Because that work before our workshop really sets us up well to have good dialogue and conversations during the workshop. But there's work that we can do before the conversation, and that work really starts with you. Oftentimes we have to self-check ourselves. We have to ask ourselves, why are we having this conversation, right? Oftentimes our motives are not quite there. If our motives are to be right, or to look good, or to win an argument, to place blame, to avoid conflict, to punish somebody for what they said or what they did, if that's our motivation, I guarantee you this conversation is not going to go well. But if it is to learn, it is to gain understanding, if it's to find truth, to find common purposes, if it's to create inclusivity, if it's to strengthen relationships, the chances of these conversations going well really increases exponentially. And by the way, these motives are things that we have to check throughout the conversation, because from personal experience, for instance, if I have a tough conversation with my wife, right, I start strong. I start with, hey, we just want to have shared understanding. I want to understand your perspective. I want you to understand my perspective. And I want us to come to some agreement. I start that way. But somehow, some way, I get in my own way and my ego starts to bubble up. And now it's not about shared understanding. It's about winning an argument. And so I'll do whatever's in my power to win that argument. I'll change positions, right? I've dirty tricks, anything I can do for her to say, Jermaine, you're right. And she never does it, by the way, right? She never gives me that satisfaction, because she notices that my motives have changed. They've shifted from, this shared understanding that we can both have with one another, this strengthening relationship, to me trying to win, place blame, or be right. If you're heading to these conversations and your brain, your mindset is, I'm going to convince them that they're wrong. I'm going to tell them how wrong they are, and I'm going to convince them what a horrible person they are. Your conversation is doomed from the start. It rarely goes well. So we have to start with our own motives. And by the way, this takes a bit of courage too, because if you are confronting behavior that may be offensive to you, it's hard not to go in there and just say, I want to punish you for saying that, or I want to show you how wrong you are for saying what you said. I get the temptation to do it, but if we're really trying to change behavior or influence, that's not going to help us. So we start with our motives. If our motives are unhealthy, our ego is typically the blame. And if we can't think of a good reason to have these conversations, then we have to question whether we should have them at all. Because what we're after is dialogue. We want to create this space where two people can share with one another, right? Dialogue is what we're after. We must remember that although we may be initiating these conversations, they are not meant to be one-sided. That's why they're called courageous conversations, not courageous monologues, right? It's not just you getting on your soapbox or just sharing your opinion and expect someone just to listen to you for 15 minutes. It's how do I create this space where we can engage with one another, because people have this basic need to be heard and understood. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. But everyone, no matter what your perspective is, no matter what your opinion is, have this innate need and desire to feel that they're being heard and understood, right? It's the way that we can show a little bit of respect to one another, just to listen and hear and understand one another. So we start there. In order to create this space, in order to have this dialogue where we can get in, where we can engage with one another in this way, we have to create safety. In order for people to constructively contribute to a conversation, there has to be what is called psychological safety. And I'm sure you've all heard of this concept. As a matter of fact, the best teams have psychological safety. They're free to disagree, express ideas, be themselves, right? To have dialogue, we must feel safe, they must feel safe. And there are typically two reactions when we try to have these conversations. People will attack or they will shut down and run away. It's our fight or flight response kicks in. They'll attack or they'll shut down and run away. If you're trying to have this conversation with someone and they just clam up, they get quiet, they're not feeling safe. And that's almost easy to see. Like they're not sharing their thoughts. They feel they can't be themselves. It's too risky. They're too scared to speak up. It's because it's a safety issue, right? But also those folks that almost get bullyish, that get loud, that shout you down, that won't let you talk, they also are not feeling safe. It's just their way of expressing this lack of safety. I know it's almost counterintuitive, because even in that moment, you're the one that's not feeling safe, but really it's their issue. If I get loud and I get defensive, it's because I'm not feeling safe. I just have a fight response to my lack of safety, where others have a flight response to the lack of safety. And so we have to create this safe place where people can just relax and speak up. And so that's key. And as an initiator of this conversation, we should feel it's our responsibility to maintain safety. And I'm going to tell you how to do that in a second. But any questions there, Andrew, before I continue?
Yes, there's a couple.
Yes.
The first one is, what if one person is willing to have an honest conversation and the other person, in parentheses, the bully, is unwilling to engage in a positive way?
Yeah, I think that this is where, and before the conversation, we try to set expectations. We try to understand their why. Ask them, why can't we talk about this? Or what type of environment do we have to create where you feel comfortable talking about this? Because for whatever reason, they're just not feeling safe to talk about it with you. There's a lack of trust when it comes to having this conversation with you. Because those that you trust, or those that trust you, we can talk to each other about anything. But if there's a lack of trust, we don't feel safe at all. Yeah.
So how do you respond to the fight response so that you can hear one another?
You address safety. You address safety. So oftentimes when we have these conversations and we sense people are getting defensive, our natural response is to try to push through. And or people are just clamming up. They're not sharing. They're not talking to you. We almost think that's a good thing. We say, all right, well, this gives me more airtime to tell you how I feel, right? And it's cool. Like, let me quickly get through this conversation and be done with it. But anytime you notice that people are fighting or flighting, they're being bullyish, or they're clamming up and they're closing off, then you have to address the safety. You have to stop with what you're trying to say and meet them where they are, and try to get to a place where they can relax and feel safe. And we do that by doing one thing in particular, and I'll share that with you now. And this is what to do during the conversation. And this is one of the 5 things that you'll hear me say over and over and over again when in communications training and DEI. It's a golden rule that I live by because I've seen it play out over and over and over and over again. And that is this: it is not what you say, it is why we are saying it that makes people defensive. People rarely become defensive about the content. People become defensive because why they think you are saying it, your intent. And it's a key concept in maintaining safety, your intentions. Sharing the why behind these conversations builds trust, then ensures that people understands your intent. I can't stress this enough. People have a much easier time receiving information if your intentions are good and clear. If they know you are building up, not tearing down. If I think your intention is to make me look foolish, to put blame, to just argue with me about how wrong I am, I'm going to naturally build up defenses to withstand what I'm perceiving as an attack. You could be 100% right, but I am not going to hear you. I'm not going to listen to you. But if you make your intentions clear, you let people know why you want to have this conversation with them. You let people know you're trying to build up, you're trying to help, you're not trying to harm. People will relax. People relax. I mean, think about it in your own life. There is the people that you trust, the people who you trust their intention for you, they can tell you things that other people just can't. My wife, who I trust her intentions for me 100%. My wife can tell me things that if you said it, I would probably want to fight you, right? But my wife can say it because I know there's no one on this earth that loves me more than my wife. Don't tell my mother that. She would fight me if she heard me say that. But there's no one that loves me more than my wife. She always wants what's best for me. So as she's sharing things with me, even the things that are hard for me to hear, I never take it personal because I know that her intention is always good, always good. Intentions are absolutely key. So when we're in these conversations, during the conversation, we need to share our intent, right? And we can even start it off with, my intention in sharing this with you is with the hope that I can help you, ... Or I would like to discuss this with you to get a better understanding of your perspective. All right, so the intent is learning and understanding. Oh, the intent is to help me, right? Without a clear idea of where we're trying to go, we can go anywhere. So too often we enter these conversations without a clear purpose, or we adopt purposes that we can't control, like changing the other person. We can't change people, right? They have to get there themselves. And so we share our intent, and we do that early. It creates a level of safety. And then we also find common ground. It's so important. Maybe there's some things that, a lot of things that we're going to disagree about, but maybe there are some things that we can agree on. And let's start there. Let's start with finding some common ground. I was at a school board meeting, the board of trustees at this school in my town, the town over. And I remember where they were having this conversation about, just creating a community for their students, a safe place, a place where students can be their full authentic selves, a place where they feel emotionally and socially safe, where they can just, an environment where they can just be who they are. And I remember someone in that board meeting said, well, what about diversity of opinion or diversity of thought, right? What about that? Are we leaving room for that? And my comment was, diversity of opinion of what, right? Can we not all agree that we want to create this environment where every student feels safe, that they can be themselves, that, that they can be their whole selves, that we want to create these good citizens? I mean, let's start there. We can debate the how we get there, but let's start there. Let's start with what we can all agree on, right? And they can all agree on that. So when you're having these diversity, equity, inclusion conversations in your workspace, right? Figure out that common ground. What can we all agree on? Do we want to create an environment where people can just be their full authentic selves, where everyone respects one another, where we collaborate with one another, a culture or an environment free of discrimination and unchecked biases? I mean, who's going to say no to that? Who's going to be like, no. I want all kinds of discrimination in my space, right? Or I want all of our biases to run rampant around here. I don't want people to feel that they belong here in our company, of our environment. Start there. Find common ground, and start there. And then if we are addressing behavior, if we are being upstanding, if we are addressing bullying behavior or inappropriate behavior or something that someone said, we also focus on the facts. This is the very, very specific and very practical on how to have these conversations. We start with facts because facts are persuasive. They are impersonal. What did you see, hear, or say that cannot be disputed? Hey, when we're in this meeting, you said this, or you did this. Focus on a particular action or statement. Always avoid saying things like you always or you keep on. That never, ever works. When we speak in those terms, it just gives people easy ways to dispute. Don't use it. And this one is important too. Focus on the behavior, not the person. Focus on the behavior, not the person. It's much easier to hear, you have been late, than you are lazy. It's much easier to hear what you said, I think that's racist or sexist, than you are a racist, right? Or you are sexist. As soon as those words leave your mouth, you're going to have a hard time engaging in civil dialogue with them, right? So focus on the behavior, not the person, because it really sets us up well. By the way, the sooner you have these conversations, the better. Particularly if it is an event that you're addressing, in the moment is absolutely best if possible, because it's hard to argue against what just happened, what you just heard, or what you just witnessed. It's much harder when we're a couple weeks later, and we try to go back to that person and say, hey, a couple weeks ago, when we're in that meeting, you said this. What tends to happen is our memory gets all muddled, and you'll hear things like, I didn't say that. I don't remember saying that. Then you don't have a common ground to even begin from. So the closer you can get to these situations, the better. Now, if you're not in this space, if you're so upset and you're emotionally you're not there, that there's no way I can address this right now without blowing up or getting angry or raising my voice or just getting so mad at this person because of what they said, take your time, right? Don't do it. One, it's better for you for self-care, and two, it's going to have this conversation go better if you can come from a place of calm and level-headedness, even if you're just passionate about what you're going to talk about. Any questions there?
Jermaine,
Yes.
Is this a good time for 2 questions?
Perfect time.
Okay. What if the person is still in a defensive position even after we've explained the why?
Keep talking, keep focusing on safety. Try to get to the bottom of it. Ask them, like, what is happening? This is what I'm noticing. Call out the behavior in a gentle way. This is not like, see what you do, you get defensive all the time, this is why I can't speak to you. Like, that's not going to work. But you say things like, I noticed, like, when I try to speak this up, you get very defensive. What's going on? Like, what do you think is happening here? Or what are you feeling right now when we're trying to have these conversations? And try to get them in a place where they feel safe to open up and share. You'd be surprised, when people open up and tell you, if you just stop, jump out of content and focus on your intent and focus on them. It also builds trust, when you start to notice how people are responding and you meet them where they are. And that's something that I would continue to do. If you are talking to someone that they could just never get there, I hate to say it, but some people just takes a lot of time. And but don't try to rush the conversation. If they're not in a place to receive it and to listen, if you're not in a place to listen and understand where they're coming from, then I would pause for a little bit. Another thing that you can do is get them to go first. We can start to model behavior that we expect from them. So maybe before we share how we're feeling and what we said, we can ask them, well, how do you feel? What are you going through? Well, how do you read this situation? And we let them talk. And we kind of show them what it's like to just be able to receive some information, to listen level-headedly. Again, people, even us, like, we don't have to agree with everything that's coming out of their mouth. We don't have to agree with every point that they're trying to make. We can totally disagree with their perspective, but we can understand them. We can say, all right, I hear you. I think I understand what you're saying, right? And we can share that back to them. You'll find that they'll feel safe. There's this law of reciprocity that happens, right? I find that the more I listen to someone, the more they're willing to listen to me. And sometimes we need to go first. We need to be the first listeners. Yeah.
Okay, and the next one, how do you respond to people that say that their casual racism is just a joke and that the people calling them out are taking things too seriously?
So one of the things that's a great question. One of the things that I talk about, and I'll share with you, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is trust intent, acknowledge impact, right? There comes a point, and this is something you can talk to people about. There comes a point, it doesn't matter what your intent was. So sometimes your intent is to be funny. Sometimes your intent is to lighten the mood. Sometimes your intent is just to make people laugh, right? That's an intent. That could even be a positive intent, right? Who doesn't want to laugh, and who doesn't want a person that's trying to be funny? But there comes a point where intentions don't matter. When people are offended, when people are impacted by the things that you say, when people feel horrible about the things that you say, then intention doesn't matter. That I was just joking, or you're being too sensitive, is not a proper response. So we can acknowledge their intent. We can say, hey, I get it. And we all want to laugh. We all want to joke. We all want to have this environment where it's light and fun. But the words that come out of your mouth have impact to people, and people are hurt by what you're saying. They're offended by what you're saying. And typically humor is so we can be closer to one another, but your words are pushing us apart, right? They're making it hard to be in relationship with one another, right? We should be laughing together, right? So I think you start with just explaining the difference between intent and impact. And there comes a point where just saying, I didn't mean it. That wasn't my intention. I was just joking, is not a part of the equation anymore. We trust that people are coming from a good place, but we acknowledge, even if they think they're coming from, even if they are coming from a good place, we can acknowledge impact. Yeah, very good.
Someone said, interesting, when I've let the other person talk, they go on the offensive.
Yeah, very good. Because they don't understand how to have these conversations, right? And so they're attacking, and your natural response is to feel defensive. But yet again, you may not feel very safe. But sometimes I say in courageous conversations, the most courageous thing we can do is listen to people. It's hard to speak our mind. Sometimes it's even harder to listen to someone's opinion that's very, very different from ours, right? And this is where that courage maybe can come in, where you have patience and you let them talk, and you kind of model what it looks like to be able to listen. with them. It's definitely not easy, for sure.
The last one for now is it preferable to call someone out in the moment in public or to wait until you can speak to them privately?
That depends. If you can speak to them privately, people feel much safer in private. They have a bit more humility. It's much easier for them to admit wrong when it's one-on-one. It's a hard position for someone to be in front of a team or a large group of people and to say, "Oh, I was wrong. I totally messed up there." That's difficult for any human being. Some people can do that, and I commend them. I admire them, but that is very, very difficult. I think each situation is a little bit different. Sometimes it's necessary to speak up in public, particularly if we are upstanding and we need people to understand that certain behaviors, certain remarks are just not acceptable here. Because the danger in not addressing it publicly, if the impact is a public impact, right, is that you may have this conversation privately, but the rest of the team is wondering, what just happened here? And how are people allowed to say these things? So I think you have to kind of take a step back and engage, is the impact public? If so, then maybe we should have a public response to this. If it's a small private impact, maybe we can have a small private response to this. But great question.
One more. How would you recommend a person in a leadership position respond to a mid-level manager regarding a response that was not respectful, ... Would you recommend sharing with this manager's direct report first, or would you recommend the person in leadership talking directly to the manager, skipping his or her direct report?
Okay. So let me continue about how we respond to a person in leadership position and respond to a mid-level manager regarding a response that was not respectful. Would you recommend sharing with this manager reports first, or would you recommend the person in leadership talk directly to the manager, skipping his or her direct reports? I'm not sure if I quite understand like who's saying what in this question, so my apologies. But I think if you're a leader, I will tell you this. Generally speaking, I believe as leaders, more is caught than taught, and it's one of the other 5 things that you hear me say. More is caught than taught. And as leaders, we have to model behavior, and people have to see, or we have to display what we expect from others. So if this mid-level manager said something that was not respectful, then I think we, as a leader, we go to that mid-level manager. If a mid-level manager's direct reports says something that was not respectful, as a leader, maybe you can help that mid-level manager coach. You can coach that mid-level manager and how to have this conversation directly with that direct report. So whether it's the mid-level manager making the comment that you're addressing, as a leader, you go directly to them. But you also this could be a great opportunity to coach that manager and how to have these conversations with their team, because the last thing that manager wants to do is lose credibility with their team. And it's very important for their own development. So if it's the mid-level manager, maybe it's a coaching conversation that you need to have. Very good. Anything else?
Not at this time. Thank you.
My pleasure. As we're having this conversation, we share the impact. Sometimes facts don't always paint the whole picture, right? Someone can say something and we can say, "Hey, you said this," and they can say, "Well, is there an issue with that? Right? Is there a problem?" Right? And so this is where we share the impact of what they said. We can say things like, "I felt," or "When I heard you say, I had this reaction." This is where you talk in the first person. This is where where everyone thinks. This is where you talk about how it impacted you. Explain why it's important to you, why it might be important to them. By the way, this takes a bit of courage. It's one thing to say, "Hey, you said this." It's a whole nother thing to say, "You said this and it made me feel this way." It's hard. It's a hard thing to do because you're putting yourself out there. And we want to express these views as views rather than facts too. Like, when we interpret their behavior a certain way, we want to make sure we express it that way. And then we dive into dialogue. And I think this is very important. Remember, this is about how do we engage with one another, right? How do we have a conversation, not a monologue, not 5 minutes just to tell people how wrong they are, but how do we engage in the way that people are open to hearing what we have to say? And we have to be open to hearing what they have to say. Maybe it's something we got wrong. Maybe it's something we took the wrong way. But this is where we tend to find that out. And so we invite them into this conversation, and we do that simply by sharing, well, what are your thoughts? Do you see this differently than me? Can you help me understand where you're coming from? What is your perspective? We give them an opportunity to respond. Typically, this is where we say, this is the last time I'm going to mention this to you, right? Like, resist the urge to deliver ultimatums or jump into, well, what are you going to do about it? How are we going to ensure this doesn't happen again, right? We want to ask these questions. We want to start a dialogue. We want to be open to the possibility that maybe we're missing something. Be open to acknowledging our part in the issue. Maybe we had a role to play. But if anything, at the very least, we want to show this respect that I'm willing to listen to you and hear your perspective. And I want to earn the right for you to listen to me and my perspective. And to do that, we have to have empathy. We empathize first, right? There's a difference between sympathy and empathy, right? It's not about feeling sorry for people or giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's this act of the imagination where we try to look at the world from their perspective, right? A human being whose history and point of view are as complex as your own. What I'm learning as I engage with more people, and this is hard for me to say, but I think this is true. Sometimes I'm talking to people, I'm like, how in the world can you think that way? How can you have that perspective? It's so radically different from me. What I think I'm learning is if I were them in their shoes, exposed to what they've been exposed to, raised the way they've been raised, getting my news from where they got their news from, and talking to the people that they talk to, I would probably draw the same conclusions, probably. And I try to go into these conversations with that mindset that these are people who think a certain way. And I may not agree with that certain way, but I'm willing to try to understand where they're coming from. I'm willing to have empathy, even for those that you may not kind of want to have empathy for, but it's important, because how can we expect something from someone else that we're not willing to give? How can we expect empathy from them if we're not willing to give empathy to them? How can we expect understanding if we're not willing to understand? And so we can have cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, right? We can understand, their perspective. We can feel what they feel. It takes courage to do this. This is hard work, but it's how we have these conversations. Because I would tell you, the way we're trying to do it now is just not working, right? And if we continue to think it's going to work, I think we've proven that how we're approaching these conversations right now, people just dig in and they just get stronger in their beliefs. So something needs to change. And so what I'm hoping to offer you today is an alternative to what we know doesn't work. And it doesn't work when we just try to debate someone into believing what we believe, or to punish or argue them into belief. That just we're seeing what that looks like right now, and I think we're all kind of paying the price for it, honestly, of our inability to do this. And listen to them. People don't want to be, you don't necessarily have to agree with them, but they want to be heard. They want to be listened to. And this is, I think we all know how to listen, and all know what it's like to be to listen. I will also say, share your story. I will tell you that stories are very powerful. Human beings make sense of the world through stories. We can use these storytelling skills to effectively advance understanding and action. I was working with another local school district and working with their teachers. And in my DEI presentations, we talk about the case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we say why it's so good for innovation and collaboration and teamwork and attracting and retaining talent and avoiding risk. I mean, all great reasons. It allows us to live according to our values. And my hope is that they're motivated to care about these issues. I was working with this local school district, and those are the conversations that I had the privilege of leading. But there's something that moved the needle more than anything that I could do, is when they had former students come in and share their experience of going through their school district. So I live in Maine, And if you don't know this, Maine is the whitest state in the country. That's statistically true. Like, that's government consensus data, right? So as you would imagine, our institutions aren't very diverse when it comes to race. So the school district looked just like Maine looks, and they asked some of their previous students of color to share what it was like to go to school there. And there's nothing that I could have done that could have had the same impact of these students telling their story of their experience. When they heard things like how invalidated they were in their experience there, how they would be hurt or offended, and they would go to administration, to the teachers, and say, hey, I'm hurt, I'm offended, can you do something? And they would be told, well, boys will be boys, or kids will be kids, or you're just being too sensitive, or this is just kind of what it's like in middle school or high school. And they learned that they just can't go to their teachers or educators to have these types of conversations. When they heard these stories, these students tell these stories, their hearts were broken. They couldn't believe that that was the environment that they were working in. And again, those students in that 5, 10, 15-minute conversation was able to do way more than I can do in a 2-hour workshop. We all have these stories to tell. And I would draw on those stories. Share your story of what discrimination has looked like and felt like to you. Share your story where your gender or ethnicity or race contributed to a tough situation for you. Or maybe share your story about your own DEI journey or process of change, right? It's hard to argue against someone's story. So share your story during this conversation. Stories are impactful. They move the needle. I'll pause there and see if there are any questions.
Yes, there is one, and you might want to follow along with me
Yes.
on this one.
Yes.
I am not usually that good at reacting in real time. I often experience what's called a spirit de el escalar, i.e., I think of a response once I'm out of the situation.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on how to better on your feet in the moment?
Yeah, that's great. It's almost like the same thing as like people who are very fast, like witted. I mean, I admire those people that they can just think of the right thing to say in a moment. I think of that clever comeback like when I'm in bed later that night. I'm like, man, I wish I would have said that at that gathering. That would have been so funny, right? But it also happens when it has these, when we're in the middle of these conversations. Sometimes we're just caught off guard. And by the way, I'll be 100% transparent with you. I miss these things. Sometimes I'll hear something and I'm just like, I don't know what to say in the moment. I'm almost shocked. And you would think, as someone who workshops and trains and understands, at least in, how to have these conversations, that it would just be natural and I always get it right. I do not. And so I say that to be an encouragement to you, because you're not always going to get it right. You're going to miss. You're not always going to be able to speak up in the moment. And it's going to happen. It's just going to happen. Doesn't mean we have to leave it there. We can go back and revisit. We can just do what we feel empowered to do and learn from it. So I guess my point is, don't beat yourself up. If something happens in a moment, for whatever reason you froze, which we all do from time to time. Sometimes, again, it comes from a place of shock. Like, I can't believe they just said that. Like, I don't even know what to do, right? Or like Carrie says, sometimes it's better to take the time and respond later with a well thought out reply. I agree with that. Like, if you just think, I just don't have the words right now to clearly articulate how I'm feeling, take the time, because ideally you want this conversation to go well, and anything we can do to increase the odds of these conversations going well is something that we want to take the time to do. Good?
All good.
Excellent. All right. After the conversation. So you're having this conversation, you're in dialogue. I would just say focus on relationship. Oftentimes, again, we worry about relationship and having these conversations. This is especially true if you're in a leadership position. Leadership is relationship. So we need to be intentional about building and maintaining our relationship. Sometimes we're saying things to people that are just tough to hear, tough to receive. And just focusing on that and just letting them know how you are and everything's good and how we're going to move forward from here is very, very important. I will also encourage you to speak up and speak out. These conversations are hard because they are fearful. We have fear. We feel that fear, but a way to one way to think about courage is to treat it as a muscle, right? Some people are born with better muscles than others, but everyone can improve their muscles through training and practice. So if we practice going out of our comfort zone, if we, speak up on these small ways, then we're more prepared to speak up in the big ways, when in the more egregious things that happen. So if we treat courage like a muscle, we're just intentional about getting better and getting stronger. Don't ever expect to be 100% comfortable before having this conversation. If you are waiting till you feel 100% I got it, right? 100% confident, 100% comfortable, you may never get there. I'm never comfortable, like 100% comfortable having these conversations. Maybe that's a bit of my personality. There's always a bit of discomfort for me because I do care about that person. I do care about relationship. I want to make sure I come off right. I don't want to offend. I don't want to make things worse. I don't want to say the wrong thing, right? I have these things kind of flowing through my mind. So you're going to always feel a level of discomfort, but feel that discomfort and lean into it. Just do it anyway. That's where amazing things can happen. And you're not always going to get it right, by the way. You're going to make a mistake. You're going to say something like, oh man, I wish I would have said that differently. Or I should have framed it this way, not this way. You're human and you're not perfect, and you just learn from it and just do better next time. Do better next time. We are all growing, and this is a process for us all. I also want to share, again, if not you, who? I'm going to encourage you to stand in the gap. Sometimes this means speaking truth to power. Particularly if you're in a privileged position, sometimes you have the ability to call out and accept the behavior in ways that those who've been historically marginalized cannot. There's too much at risk, too much at stake. And if it's not you, who? If it's not you, who? So I'm going to encourage you to do the hard thing and use your voice and use your influence in a way that makes our environment a great place to be, an inclusive place. If you just want to, these are guidelines that I use. I just wanted to quickly share this with you before I close. Guidelines with you and just creating a space for us to talk. So maybe it's not a comment or bullying or a certain behavior, something you saw. Maybe it's just like, how do I create a space where we can just be authentic, where we can engage in these types of conversations? So maybe it's not reactive, but maybe it's proactive. And I mentioned when I do DEI work, I start off by making sure we're set up well and explaining how we'll like us all to show up. So these are the guidelines that I use before every diversity, equity, inclusion training, before every conversation on examining privilege, because privilege is, I guess, obviously a cuss word these days, right? Before every conversation on gender identity, before every anti-racism conversation, before anything we talk about diversity, equity, including our identities, I get some agreement on how I would like people to show up. And that is that we're going to approach these conversations with respect. We're going to respect one another. We're going to respect perspectives. We'll put aside preconceptions. We honor confidentiality. Like sometimes, some things are shared with us that should stay with us. We lean into discomfort. We don't run away from it. We listen to understand versus listen to respond. So the goal oftentimes is just, let's just understand one another. Let's expand our perspective and expand our understandings. We trust intent, acknowledge impact. So we say up front, hey, I'm going to trust you're coming from a good place, right? I'm going to make the decision to trust that you're trying to build up, you're not trying to tear down. However, we will acknowledge impact. If you do say something that crosses the line, we're going to acknowledge it. Maybe we learn from it. Maybe we even apologize for it and we move on. The goal is to create a safe place. And like I mentioned earlier, we accept non-closure. Some of these things just can't wrap up in a neat little bow. So these are some things that, some maybe guidelines for you if you're just trying to create a space in your wherever you are to say, let's have this difficult conversation. Let's talk about some of these sensitive issues that I think we're all thinking about, but we haven't created space to discuss. Doing your work to set up those conversations can go a long, long way. And so how to have a courageous conversation? One, would be brave, right? We feel that fear and we do it anyway, right? That's why it takes courage. So we're brave. We start with us, our motives, right? What is our intent? Why do we want to have this conversation? We almost begin with the end in mind, like Stephen Covey would say. We state our intent, like this is why I'm having this conversation, right? It builds trust. We start with facts. We share the impact it may have had on us personally, right? So it's not about your intent at times, it's about how it impacted me. And we dive into dialogue. We try to have a conversation about something it's typically very, very hard to talk about. That is how, in a nutshell, in an hour and 15 minutes, how we have courageous conversations. But I want to open it up for some final questions or about anything. And I also have a couple questions here that I wanted to address for those that sent in questions. And maybe, Andrew, if it's okay, I'll just read a couple of these and answer them. It was how to do this with bosses in a way that produces change when needed without becoming perceived as a whiner. I love that. And this is where we can find common ground, whoever answered that question. Let's make sure we're aligned on why we need to have these conversations, what we're trying to do. And then, so now you're not a whiner, you're just you're a catalyst for change. You're a catalyst to make things happen. So I think that's very important. Someone also asked, would the approach be different based on the age of the person you're speaking with? They mentioned they work for a nonprofit that helps undersourced high school students. Man, I appreciate your work there. Keep up the good work. That sounds like awesome, awesome work. Do you have tips for navigating these conversations with teens? I think you'll find that teens are way more open than we are. I think they're way more progressive. They're way more open-minded. They're used to being exposed to different perspectives. And I almost think you may find it a little bit easier engaging teens in these types of conversations. And I don't think there's anything about their approach today that would change. I think with teens and kids, we just have to meet them where they are. People also say, well, when is it time? Usually if they're asking questions about these things, then they have a genuine willingness to want to understand about these things. So I try not to take teens or kids any further than they're willing to go, any further than they've kind of let me know that they want to go. So when they ask questions, though, that gives us some space to answer them. Any other questions?
Yes, respect is in such short supply these days. People see more emboldened than ever to disrespect others' points of view.
Yeah, interesting. I 100% agree with you. We just don't respect one another. We tell all kinds of stories with one another. It is very it's very difficult to engage with one another these days. Somehow we've created this environment where it's what used to be not always easy, but used to be fairly common, right? For us to just engage with one another, that we can have different points of view, but still respect one another, care for one another. It's almost you can't do it now. So I agree. I love this quote by this comment by Ellen. So youth seems to be more accepting but less tolerant. In fact, very good. You may know more than me. More accepting but less tolerant. Very interesting. It sounds like I find that they tend to be fairly open-minded, and they're actually, if anyone, any group of people that are willing to have these types of conversations, it tends to be the youth. They're just open to it. Very good. How else can we provide diverse and equitable care within our community? Also, how to be more inclusive within our community / health center. Another great question. I think that we have to connect this work to our culture. So diversity, equity, inclusion, diversity is almost a noun, right? It's diversity is you almost boil diversity down to numbers. Like we can number the identities in our spaces. But I think, as you all know, diversity is not enough. Like it's one thing to have diverse people in the room or around the table. It's another thing to leverage that diversity, right? And that's where the magic of DEI work comes in. How do we leverage these diverse perspectives, these diverse voices? How do we get a sense of what these life experiences are like? Because they're radically different than ours. That is inclusivity work. And inclusivity work is about culture. So diversity is a noun, inclusivity is a verb. What are we doing? I like to say that inclusivity is about creating this culture where all, no matter how you identify, feel welcomed, They feel valued, they feel respected, and they feel heard. Welcome, valued, respected, and heard. If we get that, we'll start to feel this sense of belonging, no matter what space we're in. And we all, no matter how we identify, want to feel that we belong. So we can start there. We can ask ourselves, what are we doing to make sure everyone feels welcomed? How are we showing that we value them? What does respect look like for them? And are we doing it? How are we making sure that people are heard? Better yet, ask them directly. Ask them directly. Some of these things we don't have to guess. We can say, what is your experience here, right? Where are our blind spots? What are we doing or not doing that's making it difficult for you to feel that you belong here? And then we listen, but we do more than listen, we actually do something about it. Because there's only one thing worse than not asking for feedback, is asking for feedback and then not doing anything about it. It's better not to ask. You lose trust and credibility. Any other questions?
I don't see any.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. I know we have some final words here. I just really appreciate your time and the privilege that I had to spend this time with you. I felt like I heard my voice way more than I'm used to. I like hearing your voices more because I really do like interactive session where we can kind of model what this looks like as we just learn from one another and listen to one another and share perspectives. This format didn't allow us to do that, but I really do appreciate your questions and thank you for the level of engagement that you've given me over the last hour and 20 minutes or so. If there are ways that I can support you or help you, don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you again, Enterprise. I just appreciate you giving me just a voice here today to be a part of what a wonderful series that you have going on. It's just been such a privilege, and thank you all for being here with me today. It was such a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to turn it over to Crystal.
Thanks, Jermaine.
Welcome.
And I think it's safe to say that we were the privileged ones here hearing from you. Your presentation was so powerful, and we just thank you for creating this space for us all to learn and engage around what is just such an important topic every day, especially today. So, and of course, thank you to Enterprise Bank for making this series possible. I'm Crystal Bates from Essex County Community Foundation, and we are proud supporters of this series, along with other great community partners like Greater Lowell Chamber of Commerce, Greater Lowell Community Foundation, Harbor Care, Lawrence Partnership, Lowell Development and Financial Corporation, the Lowell Plan, Nonprofit Alliance of Greater Lowell, and the Theodore Edson Parker Foundation. And if you liked this, I know we have well over, 150 participants. Don't miss Enterprise Bank's next seminars coming up next week, From Stress to Strength, Leveraging Your Experience, Identity, and Values to Build Resilience and Gain Hope, coming up on Tuesday. And the time is now to unerase LGBTQ history, coming up next Thursday. Thank you again, Jermaine, and thank you everybody for joining us.